So I'm Director of Digital Projects at the Greater London Authority, and a substantial part of my work is around the release of London's public sector data into the public domain. And I've been working in that space now for a year and a half, so I thought I'd share some of the learning that we have so far. But they're really kind of personal reflections and my experience around data release. And sort of when you're asked to do a keynote speech, it kind of forces you to think through some things. Because I would say, in honesty, when I started a year and a half ago, there were some very basic, simple principles that govern my work. One, basically, that data is a public good, and therefore it should be out there. Secondly, that if it's available under freedom of information, then citizens or residents shouldn't have to go through any bureaucratic nightmares to get it, and we should have a presumption of openness. And I think that's extremely important in terms of restoring trust and faith in public institutions, which is not, shall we say, at its highest point. And so they were the kind of main things that govern it. So let's just get it out there and let's do it. And then really, I think I would describe myself as becoming a battering ram, because the business of data release in the public sector is quite difficult. So a lot of my work was really trying to engage with agencies such as TfL, the Met Police, the London Development Agency, to simply release the data. So a huge amount of energy just went into the lobbying function of that. So I didn't spend too much time thinking what was going to happen when we actually got the data out there. And over the last year and a half, of course, those debates have been growing, and people like Will Perrin and my colleague Janet in the GLA have been asking questions about the usability of this data and how useful it is for residents. So I would say there are three propositions for me in terms of the open data movement. First, there's a public sector transformation proposition around data release, which has probably little to do with the public, except that if we get better public sector practice, it's going to have a knock-on benefit for our citizens. There's an economic stimulation proposition, and then there is a democratic proposition. So I'm just going to talk through what I think those three propositions mean. So the first thing I would say is, in organisational development terms, it's not about data. You start talking to organisations about releasing data, and that's the first sentence. And the second sentence is, what if there's a problem? What if the data is wrong? What if the politicians disagree? What if people use it wrongly, which always fascinates me? What if people start asking us to make different decisions based on this data? So you start talking about organisational competency, organisational skill sets, which are around how well can we engage with these issues. So fundamentally, you're asking essentially command and control organisations to open themselves up in a very different way to the way they're used to. So for me, it's not really about data in that theoretical sense, it's about organisational change. So that's kind of a theoretical proposition. The second point in that, it's about leveraging innovation into the public sector, because when you start working in the open data movement, you come across a huge amount of innovation, and we have had that evidenced very much in the London Data Store. So when we started the Data Store, we didn't build something, we didn't build a portal and ask people to come. We sent an open call out to London and said, we want to release our data, will you come and help us do this? And so we had no other proposition than that. And we had a workshop in City Hall where 60 software developers, social innovators, entrepreneurs came to help us. And they gave us a very clear steer on what they wanted. They also told us, in a sense, they were a little cynical about our ability to do this as the state. And they told us the data sets they wanted, which were transport and crime. We've gone some way on transport, a little more to go on crime. But part of that was not only that input, but a continuing engagement with us in the Data Store. So we now have 1,580 people following us on the London Data Store Twitter account. I have had a huge amount of help and support from very technically skilled, very innovative people. So when I've run into barriers within the state, I've been able to email out a sort of guerrilla army of people who are very, very versed. So when people say to me in an agency, we can't do that, it's not technically possible, I send a load of emails out going, they're telling me it's not technically possible. Give me the questions I need to ask. And so they do that, and that's been tremendous. And I would say that has affected not only the agenda for data release, but also my own working practice. So my own policy practice has been, extremely informed by what I've learned through discussion with those innovators. And this is a fantastic moment in time for the public sector to draw on people who are there who really want to help government. Mark Drapeau, who's an American technologist, talks about what he calls the goverati. And he says there are people who are both inside and outside government, who know something or have an interest in the public realm. They're passionate about technology, they're skilled communicators, and they're networked. And I would say that perfectly categorizes the people we have had involved with us in the data store. And so the existence of the data store is because of collaboration. It's not something the GLA did on its own. And the model, I would say to you, for data release is sort of a Venn diagram, if you think of it. It's the state, so we can bring our data to the party. It's digital disruptors who can exert pressure from outside, and it's the media. So I don't believe that the state will do this on its own, because bureaucracy is hardwired to resist releasing certain things. It just is. So we need to have external influences to help us do that better. And the last thing I would say is we're not there yet in terms of organizational change, because data release is very emergent. So bureaucrats and officials spend a lot of time worrying about releasing data sets, but they don't always judge what ones are going to cause a controversy or what ones are going to add value. So the example I would give for us in the London Data Store was what we call the SPAD data, which was signals passed at danger. Okay. So all you guys are going home in the tube, and suddenly somebody's got a map that says the Northern Line is the most dangerous line because they've passed the drivers there in the Northern Line, they've passed more red lights, and everybody was fretting about it, and we released the data, and nobody did anything with it. So it's a really useful example of saying public sector officials and civil servants are not good at determining what is of value. So when we started the data store, we said to people, I said to them, I want your data. And they said, well, what data do you want? And I said, well, what data have you got? Because it's not up to us to make that decision. So I would say they're the kind of propositions in terms of organizational change. The second proposition, of course, is in terms of economic development, and we've seen that, and I'm sure that's been referred to this morning, in terms of what people do with this stuff. Mayor's cycle hire scheme is a very good example. TfL, when they started, wanted to do a competition with public money to generate interest in app development. All they had to do was put the data out. We now have, I think, 15 apps on cycle hire. So these are examples. We have Placer, we've got Tube Radar. A lot of the transport ones clearly are developing traction. And that's really important for developing SME capability in London. So these are small businesses that need to build up, very agile, low cost, returning an income to the exchequer. And I would expect that to continue as we release more and more data. The last thing then, of course, is the democratic accountability proposition. And really, I guess that was, I only really started thinking about that in the sense of there's an assumption, isn't there, that if you put this stuff out there, we're going to have lots of armchair auditors. But as I say, people like Will and Jana pointing out, well, what are the capacities for people to actually be able to manipulate this data, use this data? And I think more importantly, my own view would be we will not see that kind of traction in a democratic sense until everything is released. Because what we have at the moment, if you imagine it, is a bit of this, not this, some health, maybe this, right? And so you need to release everything to allow people to actually put that stuff together. And it's what emerges from that is what's going to facilitate capacity for interpretation. So I think that's important. So I think, whether or not, for me, the public are actually using this data at the moment is not so relevant to me. What's relevant to me is that it is a public good, and therefore it should be out there, and that we should be in a society where there is a presumption to openness. And I have no doubt that the public will use this over time, and certainly that's why the launch of Making a Difference with Data is such an important thing, because we need those kind of resources to enable people to take full benefit from this data. So they're my sort of thoughts really from the work on the London Data Store.